All right, so hello again, and welcome to the last substance demonstration of the day. And my name is Bradford Smith. I'm a senior texture and shader artist at Naughty Dog, and I was largely responsible for the adoption of the Substance Designer pipeline. And it's really been quite a journey. For the last 4 years, we've worked hand in hand with Allegorithmic to really make something special, and really thrilled to be here today and share that journey with you. So let's go, right? Trying to match their energy. So before we begin, let's take a look at some images from the game and some of the artists at Naughty Dog that use both Substance Designer and Substance Painter. So here we've got Young Sam's dirt bike here by a foreground artist, Brian Kenny. And in the foreground department, they largely use a lot of base materials and Substance Painter. So here we have an example of a city car by Tate Mosesian, the environment lead, and Jacob Norris. And this is a good example of a procedural template that was set up inside Substance Designer, and then we could create a lot of car variations throughout the world from that template. So here you might recognize this as the Hero 4x4 from the story trailer. And this is done by the amazing Inkyo Lee on the foreground team as well. And of course the arch nemesis, the turret truck. You may have seen Christoph demoing this guy earlier. So all of these props were done using Substance products. So here we have an example of what a typical tiling environment texture might look like. And this is completely procedural, done by Rogelio. And here we also have a rough cobblestone as well. So this is a good example of an architectural man-made environment that is, I would say, about 80 to 90% completely procedural. So a lot of the materials that you see here were made almost exclusively with Substance Designer. Here's another shot from that level. And you see that one of the things to point out is we've definitely adopted a PBR pipeline and workflow and HDR lighting. So in contrast to that, here's another good example of an organic, natural underwater environment. And again, a lot of the surfaces you're seeing, from all of the algae and growth to even the rock faces, a lot of these textures are completely procedural, done with Substance Designer. So the talk is going to be kind of split. Our journey is going to take us through the evolution of the pipeline, and I'm going to share with you the journey that we had with Allegorithmic. And then I'm going to take you inside some of these files to really emphasize some of these principles and show you how we worked. We're also going to look at something kind of unique that we did, where we really focused on how to increase our efficiency when it came to workflow. So we kind of used Substance Designer as a sort of mini content management system. And we're going to take a look at what makes some of our internal studio workflows unique, and then I'll share with you some predictions of what the horizon might look like for the workflow. So when we talk about tools and creative process, it's really important to understand the culture at Naughty Dog. And it's one that's very open, it's flat, and it lives and dies on its ability to collaborate and be creative, right? So it means that we have a very flexible workflow, and that's going to be a key component to everything that we do. We want all of our artists to really focus on what it is they're good at and be creative. So every tool that goes into our pipeline is to empower them. So to set the stage, here we are in 2012, and Uncharted 3 is wrapped, The Last of Us is in full production, and we're very lean at the time, right? So it was important for us to set a precedent for Uncharted 4. On the art side, we didn't have a lot of technical and programming resources, so it was really up to the art department to rally and define what the future looked like. So we knew, like most people adopting physically based rendering, that consistency and quality were going to be really important. So we needed robust libraries, base materials, all the things that you've seen in other great presentations. But another really important aspect to that is we wanted to layer all those materials and then inherit them across multiple assets so that to share all of those settings. But one of the biggest challenges that we faced is, if you're familiar with the Uncharted franchise, you know that it is as huge as it's richly diverse, right? So we knew straight away volume was going to be an issue, because you see in all of these levels, and actually these are all fairly natural in theme, but of course we have architectural environments as well. They're very broad, and not only do they have to look good from far away, but they have to look good up close, because it's a very exploratory and immersive experience, right? So we had a lot of ground to cover. So naturally we started out with gathering a lot of different reference, right? So this is just a ballpark overcast day, just to get a rough sense of what albedo values and colors would look like for our textures. Another important part of it is to set up a lot of pre-calibrated lighting environments, right? So this was a standard set of various lighting conditions and time of day so that you could evaluate materials in these conditions and have some faith that they're going to work in a variety of different lighting conditions in game. So, here we are. We need to meet all these challenges, but it's really important for us, again, to really find the marriage between a standardized common workflow and to really make sure that our artists are free to be creative, right? And that's a very narrow sweet spot, because we don't want to black box anything, and that's really important. So naturally, Substance Designer fit really, really well into that pipeline. And here we are at version 2.5. And as I said, it was the start of a really, really unique relationship, and one that we were happy to be a part of. Not only did they help define our workflow with us, but we really helped inform some of the features that went into subsequent releases of Designer. So naturally, and many of you may have come into this or are facing this now, and you wonder, well, can we really get high quality results out of procedural tools? And I think with everything we've seen, the obvious answer nowadays is yes. And our answer was yes. Spoiler alert, right? So, but we also needed to prototype our pipeline, right? And more importantly, we know we leverage a lot of outsourcing partners, so we have to make sure they can use it effectively. And as you're probably already familiar with, we hand sculpt and paint a lot of our assets, right? So it seemed natural that we start simply by taking our height map out of ZBrush on the left-hand side, and then generating all other maps out of Substance. So as few inputs as possible, and then try to do everything inside Designer. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see our engine is going to be doing all of the material blending. So we said, okay, well, there's clear advantages to that, right? It's completely non-destructive, it's a great workflow. But now let's take it one step further, let's start blending our materials together. But we didn't just want a bland sort of A-B blend response like you see on the left. We really wanted to push it and define the relationship between those materials. And another important thing is that everything comes back to form first, right? So very principally driven. We want to focus first on the forms, and if they're working, then take the texture to completion. And so this is the kind of scary looking, actually, our first prototype of our layered shader. And in some ways, it actually surpassed what our engine was doing at the time. Nowadays, it's actually much simpler. And these are all the artist exposed controls we had. And it was great because you could see one of our first nodes is called the woodwork generator. And actually, we don't use it anymore. I'll get into that later. But it's essentially a form of black boxing, wood results. So we sent our input maps, our height map and our IDs on the left-hand side. And as we move through the graph to the right, you'll notice I'm layering up materials and then outputting my final textures all the way to the right. And of course, you can duplicate that graph, change your inputs, tweak a few parameters, and you've got a whole new texture, right? So that really increased our ability to be able to iterate. And that was really important because we were on tight timelines and had high volume, but we as artists, we always want to go back and iterate. It's never perfect, and we will tweak it up to the bitter end. And so here's just those two examples there. So we said, okay, this is all great, it sounds good, let's just put it in an example scene, and let's really just test a lot of architectural, man-made, and natural surface textures. And you can see here in this shot, there's different blending strategies in Engine. We've got props, we've got tiling textures, and we were very happy with this initial result. And this was actually done, I think, 3 years ago or so, so it actually holds up decently well. But this was enough to say, let's hit the road and run with this. Another interesting thing that came out of it is there was no limits to what we could prototype inside Designer. It's effectively a compositing tool, right? So we said, wouldn't it be cool if Nathan Drake, if you're familiar with his adventures, right? He's always got his sketchbook and he's taking notes, and it's all part of like the immersive puzzle experience. So he said, what if you could take a screenshot, we'll just grab those frame buffers and then create like an interactive sketchbook. So we're exploring some runtime generation possibilities there. And actually, this is a video, I won't have time to play it, but it shows what Substance 2.5 looked like at the time if you haven't seen it. And this is actually, well, maybe I will show it. Let's just show it real quick. It's actually pretty cool. So it's an example of that early prototype. Like again, what can we do with Substance Designer? And so here, this is just another example of a few frame buffers, and we can start to really sort of play with it and experiment with this look. So while we were proving our internal workflow in-house, right, the next most important question was, can our vendors work with this? So we sent them a test file with a few instructions, and we said, deliver us this asset. And with little information and guidance, they actually did a great job, right? So we were pleasantly surprised with the results, and we said, okay, you know what, we can standardize this, do some training, move forward. This is a really viable approach. So we were ready to really dive in, okay? So we're fully vested in Substance at this point. But we still had some implementation questions. We still had to win some hearts and minds internally. Again, it's a technical software. It's a node-based software. And some artists may have some hesitancy. Now, we proved that it is a very creative application, but we still had some work to do on that front. We also wanted to standardize our baking and our asset packages, and this became really important because I talked about volume and outsourcing. And oftentimes when you get an asset back, you might need to fix the mesh, rebake it, but then what do you do when you have to change UVs and repaint your textures? We needed to be able to make really fast changes to these assets when they got in-house and really utilize the non-destructive workflow. So if we had to fix a bake, all the texturing would be updated and go through the pipeline immediately. So we started by building a node library, right? And the key takeaway here is when I was designing a lot of these, there's two main things that I wanted to keep in mind. One is small, do one thing really well, right? Also, emulate existing applications and workflows, because at the end of the day, I'm making artist-friendly tools, and we want to make the transition as natural as possible. So if you're used to doing something in one application, you now have the option to do it here as well. And then out of that library, you started to grow a lot of other interesting nodes. You'll see some like color variation controls on the left, as well as some material blending like I showed you earlier to get that like cracked paint. And then we also had a number of like topology-based masking materials. So this would take the world normal, the curvature, the ambient occlusion, all the maps you're used to using in the texturing process, and it would generate masks for you. So it became clear where Substance fit inside our pipeline, and that was right in the middle before the engine. So when I refer to the term asset package, I'm basically saying, a folder full of everything that we need. So it's going to be all the Maya files, the high poly meshes, the bakes, and they're all going to be associated somehow with a Substance file. And then all the game textures were output out of Substance Designer and put into Engine. So we started putting some restrictions on what we sculpt. So on the left-hand side, you'll notice that the primary forms and the secondary forms they're all very well established, right? But a lot of the surface detail and the sculpt started going away, because now in Substance Designer we would apply those surface details. So we could take this baluster and we could make it marble, we could make it wood, we could make it any material we want and use it across multiple levels. And then another development came out where we used to hand do a lot of IDs. We would either assign materials to parts of the mesh in order to create ID masks to assign base materials to, or in this case, this is actually a ZBrush plugin. But Substance introduced, not too long ago actually, or a little while ago, the ability to bake meshes and polygroups. So this became great news for us because, well, each mesh got an ID as well as did each polygroup. So we were able to easily extract material IDs from the mesh without that awkward middle step, right? So that really sped up that part of the workflow. So we said, okay, well, let's just make Substance our baker, right? So again, all the meshes are going to meet in Substance. We're going to bake all of our topology maps, and we're also going to blend all of our materials in Designer as well and output the game maps. So that's kind of an overview of what a typical asset package looks like and our motivation behind it. So I can show you an example now of, oh, that's crazy. I got like two mice going on. I kind of forgot the screen was cloned. So here's an example of what a typical package might look like. I've stripped a lot of extra stuff out of this graph, but here we've got the main output graph right here, which is the first thing you'll notice when you open up the package. And if I was ready to, I could just export all of these straight to game. And you'll see that all the naming conventions and everything are in accordance to our pipeline, and it's good to go. And then in here I've also got a graph for the bake maps. You'll see that bake data is referenced right here. And I've encapsulated it inside its own node because I want to be able to use these groups of maps throughout my graph. So it's really easy to work that way in material mode or in or the expanded material mode here. And then here, let's say, if I had to edit this mesh, all the bake settings are intact. So if I wanted to just rebake that mesh, then whoever set this package up, everything would already be set, and I could just tweak whatever I needed to and rebake. And then all of the texture updates would be applied to that new bake. So this became a big win for us. So at this point, we could say mission accomplished, right? Well, not so fast. So here we are, we've got an enormous library. We're spending a lot of time just debugging the growing library because, again, this was a relationship where it was kind of new to Allegorithmic and kind of new to us at the same time, and it was constantly evolving. So not only were we trying to lock down the pipeline, but we had to remain flexible during the development of it. So I had to roll up my sleeves and dig in and learn Python. Again, we're still lean at this point of the project. So the first step was to compile the library, and you're probably already familiar with this process, right? It's when you could publish a package and create an SBSAR. And this is the player-compatible version of it. It's really lightweight, but more importantly, it's self-contained. And it's also going to protect your source because we put significant investment into our library, and this was a way to kind of protect that source. So you'll see on the left-hand side a view of what an in-house artist might see. So when you see all the red nodes, we're working with the source library nodes. And on the right-hand side, this is what an out-of-house vendor might see, where they're actually working with the compiled version of our library. So this was great because it was the same nodes, they generate the same results, but it's just source protected and maybe a little bit faster. I don't know, I don't have data, but by a fraction of a millisecond probably. So Designer made it really easy to manage the deployment of those libraries, right? So with custom configuration files, we could have our internal artists working with libraries in one place, and then our external partners working with a completely different library. And the software deployment at the time, because now Substance Painter is starting to be introduced in our pipeline, bitmap to material, all the other Substance products. And this seems pretty lo-fi by today's standards, but the best I could do was a batch script and a smiley face at the end, right? So at least you're happy you're substancing. But you don't need the smiley face for that, because substancing is awesome, right? And we found that we could continue to customize a lot of Designer, and this was actually one of, where'd it go? There we go. One of my favorite customizations where we could actually customize the viewport shader to allow us to pick IDs straight from the 3D model. And this was great for complex models, because sometimes it's hard to just look at like a 2D UV island and say, well, I need this, UV shell, but where is it on the model? I have no idea. And then you're picking a bunch of IDs trying to, get the thing you need. And for anybody that's more technically minded in the audience, here's like the revelation that happened during that process. And that's that the Substance file is XML, it's open, and that's awesome, right? So what I could do is I could just parse into it with whatever tools you prefer, and I could start to fix a lot of the dependency issues that came up. I could make sure that the package is healthy. Can I resolve all the dependencies? So there's a lot of stuff that I could fix technically automatically now. And so we were at a point where we started to automate a lot more things. So the library maintenance that I talked about, the SBSAR conversion process, so that was all automated, and then how all of those libraries got set up and then sent to our outsourcing management team so they didn't have to deal with the overhead. And then also, I have some XML editing tools just to clean things up, fix some things. And more importantly, I also started gathering a little bit of analytics just to see what kind of nodes are being used and what's successful and what's not. How do we build a better library? And I think I mentioned it before, but the important bit there is small nodes that do one thing really well. And I'll show you some more examples of those soon. But they were far more successful than, let's say, one big Uber node that did one complex thing. I've actually made nodes that I forget how to use. So if I don't remember how to use it, then you can bet that the artists are probably not going to know how to use it. So to give you an idea of some of the volume we were dealing with, we've got the pipeline pretty much proven, we're ready to go. And we're working with 7 to 10 studios during the development cycle. And we're still working on these assets. Of course, the team is still working really hard to finish up the title, and I can tell you it's going to be the greatest Uncharted ever. So we're really psyched to be able to get it to you. But we're estimating about 3,000 assets, and about 2/3 of those are background and prop related. So the workflow that I just covered, that mainly focuses around our background props. So that's a significant amount of assets that have gone through that pipeline potentially. So we're customizing a lot of things, right? We have a lot of unique tools. They're principally driven as much as possible so that they're accessible and easy to understand. But we still had to really nail training, right? And by this time, we had won a lot of hearts and minds. We have documentation, example files. Rogelio and I did a lot of demos and time lapse, and all that stuff was great. But we started to transition our help documentation into our library, right? So this was really important because they became living, breathing assets. And this meant that anytime I updated, something else that it's referencing in the library, that documentation stays up to date. And if you're working in Substance Designer, you can just go there, open the example file, and see. And one of the most successful things was we actually brought a lot of our key vendors in-house for a week or two. And we had regular classroom sessions, and they would be here for a week or more. And we would also have regular in-house and assignments and reviews. So it was constant communication and just more of an organic training. And we found that actually worked really, really well and was ultimately one of the most successful things into getting our vendors working with our custom pipeline. And here you can see kind of a more typical example of what an asset package might look like. And this is a weapon set by Original Force. And it might look intimidating maybe on the graph, on the upper part of the slide if you haven't seen it before, but essentially there's only a couple things going on here, right? So wherever you see the large block, that's where we're blending a material, or we're blending two materials together, and then we're just blending the next material on top of that. And then as a final step, we blend the bake data, so the models, tangent normals, AO, and everything. So now's the time to ask, well, what really makes our internal workflow unique? And in order to really make that successful, right, Allegorithmic actually did a lot of training with us. And actually Jeremy, who's around here somewhere, he came to the studio regularly and did demonstrations and classes with our artists. And one of the things that was most important during this process is regular email updates. Even if they sat in someone's archive, because right, we don't read all of our email, who has time for that? But at least you've got this like backlog of a history and a documentation of these things in one place. And the other thing you'll notice that I can point out in this slide here is that we kind of standardized the way we lay out our graphs, and we modeled it over just basic layering. So in the yellow boxes, you'll see that we're building up all of our forms. So on the bottom, you'll see our very low frequency primary forms, and then as we move up the stack, we're going to secondary forms, tertiary, and surface detail, right? And then from a single height map, all the other maps are derived. And that was kind of important. It was like the choke point. It was the funnel point where you get one height, and then we're going to derive everything from that. And because that's going to help you with blending. It's going to help you with like parallax and tessellation. So the height map was really important. And again, we're form first, right? So super important that we had that accurate data. So when it comes to our internal texture artists, they mainly tend to focus on a lot of the tiling materials. So they work with the environment modeler who's responsible for the world at large, right? And it was natural for us that the pipeline really isn't much different than an asset. We took all of our 3D sculpts, like you see here, that are tiling in this case. We baked them all in Substance Designer onto a flat plane, and then we generated all our textures off of that. But not all of our textures were hand sculpted. A large portion of them are, but we also had many base materials that were fully procedural, and these are just some examples here. And right about this time, I keep saying that, I've kind of lost somewhere in this process. Our character and our our character and our prop team actually started to really heavily use Substance Painter once it came online. And this was a natural fit because we had a lot of materials that they've built in their own library, and they can use Painter to create a lot of masks like this fun one. It's probably milk, right? I think it's milk. That's family friendly. So, and then they would do a lot of their blending at runtime. So what does the future look like? Well, I don't know, but one thing that I know that we can improve on is our base material library, right? And a lot of people were focusing on that, but we were focusing on making artist tools first and also trying to tackle the content management side with our vendors. So in hindsight, we really could benefit from a lot more materials. I'm also really curious to actually see about moving our vendors over to a completely Painter-based workflow. It's probably a much more natural, organic, artist-friendly workflow, so there's probably a lot of wins to come out of that. And then of course, keep automating things as much as possible. Because again, Designer is incredibly good about that. It's very open, you can automate a lot of things. They've got the batch tools that come with Designer, so there's a lot that you can do there. So my talk isn't done, but I do want to thank you for listening to the evolution of this. And at this point, I'll give you a little tour of some of the assets and some of the nodes that went into some of these Substance Designer files. So I showed you this guy here, right? And this is actually a good example. You know what, I'm not going to do that because I think I crashed it earlier. But you see here, we've got a simple color keyer, that's going to take our material ID map, and I can just come in here and I can just start picking any ID I want. And this was the material ID bug output that went to our shader customization. So normally you would see the viewport update with that. And at the end here, you'll also notice, so we've set up a few safeguards too in order to check for physically safe values, right? So inside this debug, we're checking to see, in this case, this is saying that a diffuse color value may be too dark. So you want to raise that albedo. So we had some review tools built in here as well. And everything is documented so that you can hover over the output and see a little tooltip there. And so this became one of our first example assets, and it's actually still a really good snapshot of our entire workflow. And this is kind of what an artist might expect when they're reviewing a mesh after it's been baked but before the texturing process. So again, we've got all the bake data in this graph, and this is one of our review nodes. And it's going to allow you to basically just preview the UV islands really quickly, change a few material presets, and just check for projection issues or other bake issues really quickly so that you can improve this for the next stage and move on. Let's skip straight to the fun one, actually. I like this guy. So, I talked about form being critical at Naughty Dog, right? And actually, it might be a good time to actually show you a little bit about the library and how that's structured. So, we've got a very robust library over here with a lot of custom nodes. And you see that here's some examples of just some custom noises and patterns. Some of these are actually modified from the original algorithmic database. And we've also got a bunch of height maps here ready to go that are completely plug and play. And if I keep scrolling down, you'll see that there's also some 3D meshes here so that you can preview your materials on some different meshes, as well as a basic base material library. It turns out that a lot of our materials were actually generated by the artists and were kind of unique to levels. So they didn't make it back into our designer library per se, but as I mentioned, that we really should have done more of that. And then down here, I've got a technical tool shelf. So these became nodes as I was creating some of these library nodes. These were more for technically minded artists. So if they wanted to assemble their own versions of some of these custom nodes from some of these modules, they could do that. So everything through this entire process became a module of sorts. And actually, so if we dive into the Material Advanced here, I'll show you, it actually looks like there's not much going on, right? But if we come into this one, we can just keep diving a little bit more, and you see that here's a number of different modules that do very, very small tasks effectively. Not only did it help keep me sane, but it also made this process very, very flexible. So this guy's kind of cool because there's two things happening, right? So here I've got a basic rust base material right here, and then I've got a basic metal material. And normally I would just blend those together with this node, but what I've done is I've actually inserted this material modifier in between those parts of the graph. And it's allowed me to basically say, well, I want the transition between those materials to look like this corroded paint height map, right? So this became really flexible because I can actually come in here and I can just go ahead and start to experiment. Well, what would it look like if I just dropped something else in there, right? And now I can start to play with that scale, and I've got a whole, different type of look. So it became really, really flexible, and we could go back and we could revisit this, or maybe, make the corrosion bubbles a little bit better. I'm going to stick him back on actually because he looks a lot better than the other one. And you'll see that there's a few controls in here that basically allow you to recompute all of the material maps in here. And I can also turn on or off some other types of topology maps, because what I'm doing is I'm sending my AO, my cavity, and my normal and everything in here. So I can say, well, maybe I don't want the occlusion to affect this, so now it's just happening on the cavity areas. And then within that, I can also say, maybe I just want the cavity effect to happen in the valleys. Or I can just go ahead and add my slope, so now that there's this directional quality to it. Let's actually take a look at, here we go. So this was an interesting example. Let me reset the scene here. So I talked earlier about coming up with nodes that do one thing really well, right? And this was, of course, I got a little overzealous. I was like, I'm going to make one node that does a bunch of types of rocks. And it turns out it can do that, but really badly, right? In fact, the only rock I ever got out of it that I actually liked was this guy. Completely didn't even know that I could make this kind of interesting pattern with it. It just happened to be that I could tweak all these parameters to do that. But to give you a sense of how just enormous this node is, right? I won't even demo it because I don't use it anymore. I'm going to show you a better way. But it's huge. So how that workflow ended up evolving, so we can look at a more polished, game-ready example. This is actually one that I used in a shipped level. And it's using those much more modular nodes. And what's good about that is it's completely, creativity is completely open now, right? So here I'm just describing what these base shapes are. And then I'm using, this is essentially a custom splatter, right? So I can basically splatter those instances across that 2D texture plane here and get a lot of different interesting scales. And there's a number of other randomization controls in here as well. And then up here, I'm taking a very almost procedural secondary form, right? And this is a height map that you might say looks like garbage by itself. In fact, it was very important in the pipeline that our textures don't look procedural, right? And so this node, he's called a form builder. And essentially all he does, right, it's actually very simple in concept. And where is he? So essentially what he would be doing is taking the primary forms, right? And then essentially warping the secondary forms as an intensity map. And then you can blend that result back onto the primary forms. So if I demonstrate kind of what he does, so I can say more or less of the secondary form influence here. And you can see here that I'm warping it in multiple directions simultaneously in order to get a more sort of organic integration of these two layers. And I can go ahead and switch that relationship so you can start to see how I can get some interesting forms happening in this rock. So while there's nothing particularly special, I would say, about either of these layers, when they come together in this node, you can see they create something that's actually kind of organic and unique. And then there's really nothing special about it, really. I just keep doing that over and over again. So here I've got another version of that node with some tertiary forms. Again, another form builder with some, this is like a procedural rock height map. And then I do that all the way up until the very end, where I've got an auto levels on my height map. And then you see that all the other outputs are generated from that, right? So I've got my normal, my ambient occlusion, and some cavity, etc. We've also got a custom ambient occlusion node because we tend to stylize that a bit. So if I reset that guy, some of the takeaways here is we're using the height, the normal, and the cavity in order to get a stylized AO. So it really allowed us to be flexible with these types of results. And you see again, it's just built with modules, right? So just kind of like figuring out how this thing works bit by bit, and then creating library modules and then stringing them all together. And so here you see it, there's a couple different methods. I can just do a multi-frequency blur where it's a few blurs layered together, and I can really punch up the contrast by bringing in some cavity, and then bring in a little bit of that normal map sculpting just to kind of get a little more like planar quality to it. So now you can come in here and really quickly sort of, get a pretty decent AO map. And then if it's a shallow surface, I'll just raise that max occlusion value, just so that it doesn't, light isn't as occluded in those crevices. The other cool thing to point out is after all those maps are made, I've put them into this little like surface info group node, right? And again, that's just for workflow convenience. So I can grab all of those topology maps, my AO, my height, my cavity, my curvature, and I can apply them to some other nodes. I won't go there. So I was going to try to find it in the library, but that's not a good use of time, right? So here's an example of one of the nodes that uses those 4 inputs, right? And this is think of it as a grayscale soup, right? And again, this is the form first methodology in practice, right? So I've spent most of my time as a texture artist building up these forms, right? Because if they don't work, I'm not even going to go on to the colorization stage and do the material responses. I just want to make sure that the normal map is lighting in engine, it's accurate, the height data is good, and if it's not, I'm going to start over until it is. So in order to get a few color variations really quick, I've brought them all into the surface info gray node. And actually this guy is pretty high contrast, so I might use him as an example. I'm basically feeding this grayscale result. Those values are being transformed by this gradient so that the dark values are represented by this color and the light value is represented by this color. And one thing that we were able to do is technical difficulties, please stand by. It's in here somewhere. Oh, there he is. We were able to create presets, right? So I talked about our color corrected reference earlier. What we could do is we could use that reference to create a number of these gradient map presets based on our examples. So now you had the option to just choose a different type of wood. So maybe I want to apply a natural oak color process to this, or a fruit wood, or something a bit darker. So we had a number of different colorization preset nodes that could speed up that process as well. But you see what this node actually does is he's going to take those topology maps, and actually let's do this because you can probably see it better if I throw those two guys together. There we go. So what this guy is doing, right, is he's basically just creating that grayscale soup that I talked about off of those topology height maps. And I can choose how much curvature influence or height influence or ambient occlusion influence I want in that process. And as I do that, I'm kind of playing around with this local color. So it ended up being a really flexible way to get some color variation. Another cool node, I like this guy. So he's our color scheme generator. And actually in practice, I didn't use him as much. I'm supposed to tell you I used him a lot. But he was kind of a complex node, and in most cases you probably just want the complementary color when you're texturing. But what he can do, right, is he can take a base input color here, and in this case I'm telling it to just generate the complementary color. But if I wanted to, I could say, well, give me an analogous palette, right? And then I can choose that spread. So while I'm inside Designer, I'm kind of coming up with some color schemes. So I don't even have to leave the program. I can be in here and start to come up with a harmonious color palette. And let's say I like this palette and I want to run with that. I can just switch that over to actually sample from the input texture. And if I increase that range a bit more to exaggerate it, you can see that I'm essentially using it as like a sort of hue variation tool. So here's my original, well, that's the preview, sorry. There's my original texture. Here's one variation, another variation, and another. I don't know if it's kind of subtle. I'm not sure if the monitor's picking up on it, but you can probably see it more in action like that. And then this is an example of how all those nodes might come together inside of an Uber blend. So here you see I've got all these different colors that again are kind of crappy by themselves, right? I wouldn't want to ship with that, although maybe you would. Not that it's bad, it's just different, right? Here I'm doing the same thing, right? So it's again, I'm kind of a one-trick pony, right? There's like this repetition that's happening here. I'm going to take the same topology that's happening that I've got here, and then I'm going to put myself in a mode where there we go, where I'm stuck. Oh, there we go. I was stuck with a hand somehow, so the mouse was, okay, moving on. So you can see what I'm doing, right? Is I've got all of those different color maps coming into this one blend node, and then I'm creating this more rich, layered, kind of organic but stylized color texture. And all those same controls I have at my disposal. So you can see I can start to have more or less of my height and curvature influence to just play. Just, what kind of variations can I make? And then maybe make it a little, contrastier at the edges by bringing in some more of this cavity. And then for each of these layers, so actually if I turn some of these layers off and I just look at the first 2 or 3, then you can see that, yeah, there we go. And you can see that I can start to play with the relationship between each level as well. So I can say, well, I want more or less of my foreground or background layer. And there's even a little bit of randomization built in, so I can just quickly kind of like shuffle that random seed inside to get a different result. And then maybe just feather it back a little bit so it's a bit more subtle. I'm gonna show you one more thing. I've got a couple more minutes here. So this is an example of a fully procedural material. It's a brick wall, and I've done a few things to it as well. So if I just open up the base brick material, there we go, there we are. Hey brick, how you doing, buddy? So again, it kind of just emphasizes the really, really modular workflow, and that it all actually starts with this one node. Well, it doesn't start with this node, but here we have a brick pattern generator, and if we go inside him, again, it's made of all these little parts and pieces, right? So it actually all starts from just this basic ID, and then there's just a number of different other height layers that I start to blend up, right? And then again, very procedural, but you see what comes out in the end is just this kind of like subtle, sort of new broken brick kind of thing. And so once I have this material set up, this was a great example because it's still kind of new and I was using it in one part of the level, but I also had to transition it to like a cracked paint kind of look, right? So I was able to just reference it now inside of another material. And in this case, I've got this material here that's like this painted surface. And again, you'll see I'm combining it with this height map that's just this like cracked paint kind of look, and then create a whole new texture just off of combining those two things together. So any updates that I made inside this graph they were also then propagated to that other one. Well, I was going to make an update, but there's a lot of stuff going on in there. But the idea is that it's all modular and reusable, and that you can. There's really no limit to like how creative you can be in combining these things together. But the key is going to be just to, as you're working, right, no matter what your level of experience or skill set is, always be on the lookout for things that you can break apart and make into small little reusable chunks. Because ultimately that's really what led to the success of this library, right? And just having a few nodes that do a few small, simple things really well was really important. And all of these nodes that I'm showing you now were just built from all those little building blocks. And then once you have those building blocks, well, the opportunities are endless, and you can keep really just making new and interesting things that you might not even expect. So I've got a little bit of time left for some Q&A. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and have a great rest of your GDC, and yeah, thank you. I shouldn't clap for myself. That's the second time I did that, and that's like so like, yay me. Wow, sorry. Thank you.